After years of hype and comparisons to Game of Thrones, Final Fantasy XVI is finally out and everybody seems to like it. That's great news because this is a franchise that has spent the last 36 years reinventing itself time and time again, all while helping to define and popularize the role-playing game franchise outside of Japan. From the best-selling Final Fantasy VII to the countless spin-offs, this is one of the longest-running and most enduring series of all time, as demonstrated by the fact that it's still going strong nearly 4 decades later. All this talk about a new, more mature sequel got me wondering what Electronic Gaming Monthly thought of Final Fantasy back in the day. Now, before you ask, EGM ended up reviewing a total of 36 Final Fantasy games between 1989 and 2008. This includes pretty much every main series installment before 2009's Final Fantasy XIII, as well as most of the remakes, re-releases, and compilation discs. This also includes the various Chocobo spin-offs, as well as completely different franchises that Square cynically decided to sell in America as Final Fantasy games. You know, like Final Fantasy Legend on the Game Boy. Unfortunately, they did not review the original Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and there are a few other weird omissions. But with 36 games to talk about, I think we have a pretty great list on our hands. What we're going to do today is count down the best and worst Final Fantasy games using Electronic Gaming Monthly's own words and scores. There's no editorializing here, we're just going to focus on what the critics said back when these games first came out. So go and tell Sid to warm up the flying ship, because this is a mostly turn-based episode of EGM Ranks Final Fantasy.
あの勇者たちが今ニューファミコンに出会う。ニューファミコンで蘇る伝説の物語攻略本付きファイナルファンタジー1、2一つになってアンコール発売。
Alright, let's go ahead and kick things off with number 36, Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 2. Escort missions? Check. Minecart sections, explosive barrels, crates, shoot X number of enemies before you get a key card for an arbitrary gate? Checkmate! Even after 9 years have passed, I'm still interested in the Final Fantasy VII lore. So why does it take so long for Dirge to actually feel like Final Fantasy VII? Boring new characters, dull music, and drab interpretations of favorite locations have supplanted all the original RPG's charm and character. Square has wasted an unbelievable amount of potential here. Number 35, Final Fantasy II on PlayStation Portable. Final Fantasy II is the dark sheep of the series, and for once, that actually works in its favor. Since it doesn't play much like a normal Final Fantasy game, the jarring, non-Final Fantasy-like facelift doesn't seem as out of place as it did with its predecessor. Honestly, with its odd skill system and relative freedom to explore, Final Fantasy II has more in common with old-school US PC role-playing games than with its console peers. This is a quick and lazy remake, though, based on the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance version of the game. What it really needs is a total overhaul. Still, this is the first time that Final Fantasy II has actually felt playable, and that's a remarkable achievement in itself. Number 34, Chocobo's Dungeon 2 on PlayStation. Boring. I can't find a better word to describe this role-playing game. Sure, the item mixing is slightly interesting, but that's just a drop in the ocean of repetitive and flat gameplay. The random dungeon thing isn't the problem either, it's the lack of strong storyline or game structure. I felt like there was no real point in going through dungeon after dungeon, except to find stuff to level up my Chocobo. The weak 2-player co-op mode doesn't add much either. Number 33, Chocobo Racing on PlayStation. It goes without saying, if you're a publisher trying to establish a strong mascot presence, you must make a Mario Kart copycat. Chocobo Racing, unfortunately, fails to take the genre anywhere except for Cute Avenue. The game is very average in all areas, except for track designs. The power-up system is very bland and unbalanced. Fans of Final Fantasy VII and combat racing may get a kick out of this. Otherwise, leave it for the kids. Number 32, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo Tales on Nintendo DS. Judging this Chocobo cash-in by its playful cover made me believe that Square Enix had laid a golden egg. But after perusing this muddled tale of minigames, I discovered it's merely a decent adventure chock full of filler. Some of the time wasters are enjoyable, but most fail in the fun department. Still, I really dug the storybook art style and presentation. Number 31, Final Fantasy XI Online on Xbox 360. Maybe you're one of those 4 years in the making Final Fantasy XI experts itching to play your life's work on a next-generation console with all the expansions wrapped in and better graphics. In which case, you know all about the game's deep complexity and don't need to bother with the rest of us schmoes. Unfortunately, the rest of us schmoes are going to have real problems with this once respectable, massively multiplayer online role-playing game that just can't keep up with today's competition. Newbies will find themselves abandoned and bored by its ugly, lonely level treadmill that doesn't even introduce basic gameplay concepts. Number 30, Final Fantasy on PlayStation Portable. Fresh-faced Final Fantasy devotees will surely enjoy this upteenth remake of the game that launched a million cosplay and fanfiction atrocities. Yet, for oldsters like me who foggily recall questing through the original NES version, this latest re-release feels a tad inessential. Depressingly little effort went into crafting this anniversary package. Square Enix mostly cobbled together aspects from the PlayStation 1 and Game Boy Advance remakes, touching up the graphics with high-resolution art and adding one new ultra-difficult dungeon at the game's end. But look, it's hard to stay mad at this RPG rerun. At least it's an enjoyable romp that remains surprisingly engaging 20 years later. Number 29, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift on the Nintendo DS. Not every fantasy has to take itself seriously. The never-ending story style here fits comfortably with the laid-back way that I play a handheld game. Not that I dispute the continuing shortcomings of the series. Unwieldy menus and the inability to adjust the map makes playing the game more difficult than it ought to be, but it remains worth it for all the reasons that made the original Tactics so engrossing. Number 28, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings on the Nintendo DS. The way I see it, if you think of Final Fantasy XII as Star Wars, this sequel is more like Droids, the Saturday morning spin-off without the maturity, but I can accept that as well as the control. Thing is, for a real-time strategy game, you won't find much strategy in Wings. Oftentimes, the best tactic really is to rush in with everyone, and if you're losing, then just back away, heal, then rush again. I suppose the further adventures of Vaughn and friends will be enjoyable to some, but that alone doesn't turn Wings into an awesome RTS. You'd need more strategy for that. Number 27, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo. Another role-playing game from the folks at Square. The game is set up like your typical RPG, with plenty of menus, actionless battle scenes, and hours of searching for much-needed items. The music is by far the most impressive aspect of this cart, and the graphics are top-notch too. The quest is good, but geared for the younger crowd. Number 26, Final Fantasy Origins on PlayStation. An exciting PS1 release in 2003? Yep. Kudos to Square for bringing this antiquated duo stateside. It's a nostalgic must-buy for Final Fantasy fanatics. The glossy new CG cinemas, nicely arranged soundtracks, and bonus art galleries will have longtime fans reeling with joy. Only wish these remakes looked better. A little animation in the battle backgrounds or snazzier spell effects would have really added some 32-bit flair. Regardless, these games are worth the $30 for RPG fans. Number 25, Final Fantasy III on the Nintendo DS. Okay, I can appreciate Final Fantasy III's pretty, bobble-headed-esque graphical makeover and expansive job system. But this role-playing game still falls just short of being an award-winning remake. Even with all the changes, the narrative is a snoozer. And while I don't mind the game being hardcore, Final Fantasy III's dungeons are screaming for save points. Some might call me soft, but I bet even you folks will soon grow tired of searching out warp stones and praying that you don't run into an enemy when you're close to flatlining.
Okay, kid, show me what you got. Yeah, right. Next! Yes! Next! Ooh, scary. Next! Next! Next!
Final Fantasy III. Do you have what it takes? Final Fantasy III from Squaresoft.
Next!
And we're back with number 24, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates on the Nintendo DS. I found the controls awkward and frustrating. It's tough to manage your party and get to the right spells and positions mid-battle. Inventory management is also tedious, but in the long run, I really didn't mind. Seeing your character's new gear equipped is awesome. It really lends to a sense of accomplishment in what might otherwise be a rote hack-and-slash adventure. Number 23, Final Fantasy Legend III on the Game Boy. It's no secret that I dislike the Game Boy in general, but I happen to like role-playing games. The question remains, is this game good enough to make me forget the eye strain and green screen? In this case, the answer is yes. The story is great and the graphics are good for the Game Boy. If you enjoy running Zelda, this game will keep you busy on those long train trips. I have to admit to liking a Game Boy game. Number 22, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles on the GameCube. I'm sorry if this sounds blunt, but calling this game Final Fantasy probably wasn't the greatest idea. Despite the Moogles and traditional magic spell names, this really isn't Final Fantasy. There's no experience points or leveling, and really not much of a story either. Instead, you've got a fair to middling action RPG that graduates to a must-play experience with 2 or 3 friends. Just make sure that you're playing with evenly balanced characters. The monsters seem like they're tuned to the strongest party member, so very weak characters could get crushed in their wake. Number 21, Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo. This is a totally awesome role-playing game. The storyline is actually coherent, and the plot moves along with a combination of speaking sequences and battles. Sure, there's plenty of the old build up your abilities and move up a level play, but within a framework like this, how can you go wrong? Tasty game. Number 20, Final Fantasy IV on the Nintendo DS. How many times does this one game need to be remade? The DS version of Final Fantasy IV marks Square Enix's 4th revisiting of the classic Super NES role-playing game in 7 years' time. At some point, you might think that the word overkill might occur to someone over there. Still, I can't bring myself to come down too hard on this effort because it's a total, comprehensive, modern revamp featuring wholly new graphics, extra story, new game mechanics, and improved English localization, and even voice acting. Only the game's most die-hard fans won't resent this double dip. Number 19, Final Fantasy Chronicles on the PlayStation. If the term classic, old-school role-playing game conjures up fond memories of playing Final Fantasy VII, then Final Fantasy Chronicles is not meant for you. This is really old stuff with antiquated interfaces and graphics. But this stuff is also the stuff of legends. We're talking enthralling storylines, great character development, innovative play mechanics, and more. If you can get past how outdated these titles look and feel, you'll find a couple of gems in Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy IV, 2 of the best Super Nintendo RPGs ever. Number 18, Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions on PlayStation Portable. The dialogue from the original Tactics wasn't so much bad as it was blunt. The redone script feels like Joss Whedon got a hold of it, and that's a good thing. The plot is still ultra-layered and overly dense, but since the tactical combat is so good, if slow, most won't mind. Unless you have the two versions side by side though, you'll likely miss the PlayStation Portable exclusive characters and jobs, and the different camera angles are all but useless. But hey, tactics is still engrossing, time-consuming fun. Number 17, Final Fantasy XI Online on PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy XI is finally here, and damn is it a 10,000 hit point monster. But be warned, this isn't your little bro's Final Fantasy. Chocobo trappings aside, it shares more similarities with massively multiplayer online role-playing games like EverQuest Online Adventures and Asheron's Call than it does with classic fantasy titles. Two big factors keep Final Fantasy XI from being the online RPG of my dreams. First, after about 15 hours of play, it becomes basically impossible to get anything done without a big group, which usually takes some time to assemble. The second is that it's a pain in the ass to play with your friends. You have to buy an expensive in-game item called a World Pass and give your pals the pass number, and then they have to create all new characters on your server. Ouch! Number 16, Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls on the Game Boy Advance. I used to think that the first two Final Fantasy games had the longest nod-off for a few minutes battles ever, and yet the fights in Dawn of Souls seem blazingly fast to me. Maybe it's just that the other RPGs have gotten slower. Regardless, this set of remakes is way easy, but that's for the better. Novices can blaze through the game, and old farts like me can access the extra scenarios and other stuff without having to slay 80,000 imps. Number 15, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Dungeon on the Wii. July is apparently the month that Square Enix decided to kick your ass and make you like it. With such a hardcore game experience, it stands to reason that the elements that make or break it are fairly genre-specific. Indeed, only roguelike aficionados are likely to fully appreciate this dungeon-diving adventure. As with all games of this nature, Chocobo's Dungeon will mainly appeal to genre fans, but it's good enough that anyone can enjoy it. Well, anyone with a slight masochistic streak. Number 14, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King on the Wii. Square Enix's increasingly ambitious Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series is slowly overtaking the main Final Fantasy franchise in terms of innovation and heart. Take downloadable WiiWare launch title My Life as a King, eschewing the multiplayer focus of the two previous titles and offering something of a Populous meets Animal Crossing god game. King removes the action RPG focus of its predecessors and arrives at something best described as a kingdom management sim. The resulting game is more interesting than that description sounds, though. Number 13, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation Portable. I was dreading Crisis Core a bit because, let's face it, Square Enix's Final Fantasy VII remakes have run the gamut from awful to complete ass. And the opening moments bore out the worst of my fears. But then, something unexpected happened. The game became good. The seemingly mindless combat in this action game masquerading as a role-playing game slowly started to unfold into something that, while not precisely deep, is definitely engrossing.
Final Fantasy VI 4月2日スーパーファミコンで発売 Square.
And we're back with number 12, Final Fantasy IV Advance on the Game Boy Advance. Few games have had the same resonance with me as Final Fantasy IV. I feel that it was the cornerstone of what made the Super NES great. It's simply my favorite Final Fantasy game, even 14 years on. Final Fantasy IV strikes an excellent balance between an interesting story and entertaining gameplay. The battles are fast, and the characters have their own unique appealing skills. Very few Game Boy Advance RPGs can hope to compare. Number 11, Final Fantasy V on the Game Boy Advance. This fall's portable RPG showdown has gone all Civil War on us. Final Fantasy V must duke it out against Final Fantasy III DS for your valuable gaming dollar. And surprisingly, the lower Fi Game Boy Advance port actually wins out. It might not have Final Fantasy III's snazzy 3D visuals or touchscreen play, but Final Fantasy V pumps up the gameplay quotient with a masterfully designed job system, scads of challenging dungeons, and super speedy battles. Plus, the new GBA-specific content here easily makes this the definitive version. Number 10, Final Fantasy Tactics on the PlayStation. Just when I thought I escaped from the Final Fantasy universe, this game came along and sucked me back in. Final Fantasy Tactics is long, addicting, and packs all the richness you'd expect from a Square game. Its combat and character building system are complex, but the game is still supremely easy to slip into and play. Final Fantasy Tactics does start out slow, and don't expect much Final Fantasy VII quality full motion video. Number 9, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance on the Game Boy Advance. After 5 long years of waiting, I can once again sink my tactical teeth into the chess-like world of Final Fantasy Tactics, and it's been worth the wait. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance features unparalleled depth in terms of character customization and on-field tactical arrangement. Plus, FFTA doesn't drown in its own complexity and unpenetrable plot. Everything is surprisingly easy to follow, with the only drawbacks to this beautifully designed game being an inefficient menu system, occasionally cluttered battlefields, and mysteriously long loading times in the otherwise rockin' two-player link-up games. Number 8, Final Fantasy XII on the PlayStation 2. In the 5 long years since Final Fantasy X, I've gotten hungry. Sure, I sampled a little bit of the online time sink known as Final Fantasy XI, but its bland flavors weren't for me. The wait for Final Fantasy XII, though, was like dangling a delicious steak just outside of my reach for 3 years. Now that it's been served and I've consumed, I can say that this is the most satisfying Final Fantasy experience that I've ever had. Aside from the camera issues and largely forgettable soundtrack, 12 really hits the spot for me. A well-crafted cast of characters, an intricate and politically charged plot, and a fresh take on the combat. My compliments to the chef. Number 7, Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. If you don't already get the picture, this is the role-playing game to get. If you're a fan of the genre, you'll die for it. If you've never played one, it'll draw you in. From the movie-like intro to the beautifully woven story, it's just as good as it gets. And it's not just all cerebral. There's some awesome tunes accompanying the story, and the graphics are great. If you don't get the hint, get this game. Number 6, Final Fantasy X-2 on the PlayStation 2. I'm sure a lot of Final Fantasy fans are struggling with this game for the same reasons I did. I just couldn't believe that I was enjoying it so much. I mean, I knew I'd like it. It's Final Fantasy, after all, with some of my favorite characters returning to a world that I loved. But the new tone and the fact that it's the first ever true sequel makes it something altogether different. Don't fight it. Get into the groove and you'll be treated to a raucous ride that's certain to be some of the most fun you've ever had with a Final Fantasy. Number 5, Final Fantasy X on the PlayStation 2. As I expected, Final Fantasy X is a technical milestone, a stunning example of what oodles of money and expertise can extract from the PlayStation 2. The graphics shine, the battles thrill, and the voice acting entertains. However, that's not why this is the best Final Fantasy of the last decade. All those glorious graphics are just gravy, as the lovable characters and compelling story provide the true heart of Final Fantasy X. Number 4, Final Fantasy Anthology on the PlayStation. Role-playing game fans weaned on Final Fantasy VII and VIII may look at these old games' crude visuals and wonder what all the fuss is about. Trust me, these classics are every bit as enjoyable as the new stuff. Final Fantasy V stands out for its rich variety of characters and rewarding story. Final Fantasy VI is worth playing just for the deep character development system. In no other game have I had this much fun building my character and tinkering with their abilities. Number 3, Final Fantasy VIII on the PlayStation. More than any other previous role-playing game, Final Fantasy VIII immerses you so deeply in its story and characters that you forget that you're playing a video game. Almost. The battles get tedious, especially since you have to sit through every Guardian attack. They're unbelievably cool the first time you see them, but not the 101st time. I like the new battle system. I like the huge overworld that lends the game an Ultima-like feel. Most of all, I like the characters. Number 2, Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. No other role-playing game can pull off a cinematic experience like Final Fantasy VII. Right from the very start, you're immersed into the storyline and have an active role in your destiny. The full-motion video sequences are incredible, and the fighting modes are uniquely interactive. Even mild swearing made it into our review game. Add to it a rockin', mood-setting CD soundtrack, and you've got a 40-hour PG-13 rated movie, not just a video game. Its only fault is the inability to cancel the full-motion video and dialogue boxes. And finally, at number 1, Final Fantasy IX on the PlayStation. Thank the gods! Square has gone back to the soul and put the fantasy back into the final. Out with the techno epics of late and in with the flesh and blood heroes of old. Each story advancement is bolstered by excellent dialogue and short but sweet CG movies. The pacing and the tempo of the game is brisk, but Final Fantasy IX manages to tackle topics ranging from friendship, loyalty, and even prejudice with style. However, it's the characters that make the game so stellar. From the shy little Vivi to the oafish Steiner, each character earns his spot in the game. Final Fantasy IX is the highest caliber, technically and emotionally, and I wish that there were more of its kind.
Final Fantasy X
ご飯って言うろうが
ノックぐらいせんねん。
プレイステーション
今まで何回くらいキスしたかな私たち
100回はしてんじゃねえの
もう無理かなこういうの
世界一ピュアなキス Final Fantasy X プレイステーション
Hey! Thanks for watching us count down EGM's best and worst Final Fantasy games. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we have a whole playlist full of episodes just like this one. Oh boy, we tackle Kirby, Sonic, Mario, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Batman, Bubble Bobble, Bonk, Ridge Racer, Twisted Metal, Tomb Raider, and so many more franchises. There are 43 in all. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Final Fantasy game? Do you prefer the early 8 and 16-bit days? Maybe you're partial to the 32-bit stuff, which certainly dominated this list. Or are you into the new stuff, the stuff that's not even turn-based anymore? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with a whole bunch of reviews and recap episodes of Nintendo Switch Online games that weren't covered in the regular Review Crew episodes. Guys, we're finally gonna get to one of the most polarizing games of all time. That's right, it's Star Tropics. No, seriously, just wait until you see the disparity between these reviews. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.